December 20th, 1941. Kunming airfield, China. Captain Claire Chennault stood beside the wreckage of what should have been an impossible victory. 3 Japanese Nakajima Ki-27 fighters, their lightweight frames crumpled across the muddy runway like discarded paper. His pilots had been flying for exactly 12 days. The P-40's warhawks they flew were considered obsolete, too slow, too heavy, too clumsy for aerial combat against the nimble Japanese fighters that had dominated Asian skies for 4 years. Tokyo radio had been broadcasting the same message for weeks. American mercenaries flying inferior equipment would be swept from Chinese skies within days of hostilities. Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns across China, Manchuria, and Indochina, openly mocked the Curtiss P-40's as a ground attack aircraft masquerading as a fighter. Its Allison V 10-engine produced 1,150 horsepower, respectable but unremarkable. Its maximum speed of 360 miles per hour lagged behind Japanese designs by 30 to 40 miles per hour. Its turning radius was measured in acres rather than feet, but the wreckage told a different story, one that would shatter every assumption about aerial combat doctrine that had governed Pacific air warfare since the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937. Over the next 7 months, a group of American volunteers flying supposedly inferior aircraft would achieve the most lopsided kill ratio in aviation history. 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed against 14 American losses. The mystery wasn't just how they won. It was how completely they rewrote the rules of fighter combat, while everyone else was still following the old playbook. The Pacific morning heat pressed down on Taungoo airfield in Burma like a physical weight as first lieutenant. Robert Neal climbed from the cockpit of his P-40's B Warhawk, his flight suit soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. August 15th, 1941, had started with the kind of training flight that separated competent pilots from dead ones. Chennault's tactics drills, executed at altitude until every movement became muscle memory, refined through repetition, that eliminated hesitation under combat stress. Neal had accumulated over 1,800 hours of flight time during 6 years with the Navy, carrier operations aboard the USS Saratoga that demanded precision under conditions where mistakes resulted in drowning or burning. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for Chennault's systematic dismantling of everything he thought he understood about fighter tactics. The briefing room at Taungoo resembled a graduate seminar more than a military operation. Charts covered every wall, depicting Japanese fighter capabilities, with the kind of detailed analysis that suggested years of careful study rather than theoretical speculation. Chennault had served as an air advisor to the Chinese nationalist government since 1937, watching Japanese air operations with the focused attention of an engineer reverse engineering complex machinery. What he had learned contradicted nearly every assumption that governed Western fighter doctrine. Japanese fighters, primarily the Nakajima Ki-27 and the newer Mitsubishi A-60, represented a coherent design philosophy that prioritized maneuverability over every other combat characteristic. The Ki-27 weighed just 3,900 pounds fully loaded, powered by a Nakajima Hayeden radial engine producing only 710 horsepower. On paper, the performance specifications looked unimpressive. Maximum speed of 286 miles per hour, service ceiling of 39,000 feet, armament limited to 2 7.7mm machine guns, but those numbers concealed the aircraft's true tactical significance. The Ki-27 could execute sustained turning maneuvers at airspeeds below 100 miles per hour, maintaining controlled flight at angles of attack that would stall any Western fighter. Its turning radius measured approximately 450 feet, less than half the turning circle of comparable Allied aircraft. Japanese pilots had been exploiting these capabilities since the aircraft entered service in 1937, achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible according to Western combat analysis. During the Nomonhan incident against Soviet forces in 1939, Ki-27 units had destroyed over 150 Russian fighters, while losing fewer than 20 aircraft themselves. Similar results appeared in combat reports from China, where Japanese fighters consistently dominated numerically superior Chinese air forces equipped with various Western designs. The pattern was becoming clear to anyone willing to examine the evidence objectively. Japanese pilots weren't just skilled. They were flying aircraft, specifically optimized for turning combat that Western fighters couldn't match using conventional tactics. Chennault's analysis identified the fundamental flaw in Allied fighter doctrine that had cost hundreds of pilots their lives across Asia and the Pacific. Western air forces trained pilots to engage in turning dogfights, circular contests of maneuverability, where the tighter turning aircraft inevitably achieved firing position. Against Japanese fighters, this approach guaranteed defeat. The Ki-27 and Zero could outturn anything in the Allied inventory by margins so substantial that pilots' skill became irrelevant once turning combat commenced. American, British, and Chinese pilots found themselves watching helplessly as Japanese fighters positioned behind them, then methodically shot them from the sky using precision rather than overwhelming firepower. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Chennault had identified an alternative approach that exploited Japanese design weaknesses rather than challenging their strengths. The P-40's, despite its reputation as an inferior fighter, possessed characteristics that could be weaponized against Japanese aircraft through proper tactical application. The Warhawk's Allison engine produced 40% more horsepower than Japanese fighters, translating directly into superior diving speed and energy retention. While Japanese fighters achieved their remarkable maneuverability through lightweight construction and low wing loading, this same design philosophy created structural limitations under high-speed conditions. The P-40's could safely dive at speeds exceeding 450 miles per hour, velocities that would cause structural failure in Japanese fighters designed for low-speed turning combat. Chennault's tactical doctrine emerged from this analysis with mathematical precision. Japanese fighters in turning combat. Use superior diving speed to attack from altitude, make a single high-speed pass, then extend away before Japanese pilots could respond with turning maneuvers. The approach required extraordinary discipline because it contradicted every instinct that fighter pilots had developed through years of training that emphasized aggressive pursuit and sustained engagement. The briefing room discussions revealed the psychological challenge of implementing tactics that felt like running away from combat rather than pressing attacks to decisive conclusions. Lieutenant Gregory Boyington, a Marine Corps pilot who had resigned his commission to join Chennault's volunteer group, expressed the skepticism that many pilots felt toward the new doctrine. Japanese fighters had a speed advantage, he argued during one heated discussion. How could the P-40's disengage when enemy aircraft were faster in level flight? Chennault's response demonstrated the depth of his analysis through physics that transformed apparent disadvantages into tactical opportunities. Japanese fighters were faster in level flight at optimal altitude, typically between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, where their lightweight designs performed most efficiently. But the P-40's superior power-to-weight ratio and structural strength meant it could dive faster and maintain higher speeds during vertical maneuvers. Attack from above, dive through the enemy formation at maximum speed, then extend in a shallow dive that used gravity to maintain velocity. Japanese pilots attempting to follow would find their aircraft unable to match the P-40's diving performance without risking structural failure. The tactics required constant altitude advantage, which meant climbing to operational altitude before entering combat zones. The P-40 climbed at approximately 2,100 feet per minute, adequate but not exceptional. Chennault's solution involved positioning his fighters at 15 to 20,000 feet before encounters, using altitude as stored energy that could be converted to speed during attack runs. Japanese fighters climbing to intercept would burn fuel and energy reaching attack altitude, arriving at disadvantageous positions that allowed American pilots to dictate engagement terms. Armament analysis revealed another critical advantage that conventional doctrine had overlooked. The P-40's mounted 650 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, creating a combined firepower of approximately 4,000 rounds per minute. Japanese fighters typically carried two 7.7mm machine guns, with total firepower less than one-quarter the P-40's destructive capability. But American training emphasized long-range deflection shooting that wasted ammunition on low-probability shots. Chennault demanded a different approach. Close to within 200 yards before firing, use the gun sight's fixed reticle for head-on or stern attacks that maximized hit probability. Fire short bursts of 1 to 2 seconds rather than sustained streams that depleted ammunition without corresponding increases in lethality. The 650 caliber weapons could literally saw Japanese fighters in half if sufficient rounds found their target, but only if pilots exercised fire discipline that made every bullet count. The P-40's armor protection provided another advantage that tactical doctrine needed to exploit properly. The aircraft featured pilot armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust construction that could absorb battle damage that would destroy Japanese fighters outright. But these protective features added weight that reduced maneuverability, creating a trade-off that conventional doctrine viewed as a design flaw. Chennault recognized it as a fundamental difference in combat philosophy. Japanese fighters sacrificed survivability for performance, creating aircraft that were extraordinarily effective when flown by skilled pilots, but catastrophically vulnerable to battle damage. American fighters emphasized pilot survival and aircraft durability, accepting reduced maneuverability as the price for bringing pilots home alive. The tactical implication was clear. In any sustained campaign, the side that preserved its pilots would eventually achieve superiority, regardless of individual engagement outcomes. Training at Taungoo focused relentlessly on implementing these tactical principles through repetition that transformed abstract doctrine into instinctive responses under combat stress. Chennault organized his pilots into 2 aircraft elements that operated as tactical units rather than individual fighters. The leader focused on attack execution, while the wingman provided defensive coverage and threat warning. Each element supported the other through interlocking fields of fire and mutual protection that made attacking either aircraft extremely dangerous for Japanese pilots. The boom and zoom attacks that became the American volunteer group's signature tactic required precise timing and spatial awareness that could only be developed through extensive practice. Dive angles needed to be steep enough to build maximum speed, but shallow enough to allow accurate firing solutions. Approach speeds needed to be fast enough to prevent Japanese interception, but controlled enough to allow target acquisition and weapons employment. Recovery from attack runs required immediate transition to maximum speed climb that exploited the P-40's superior power loading, gaining altitude for subsequent attacks, while denying Japanese fighters opportunities for pursuit. Mock dogfights against friendly aircraft revealed the tactical doctrine's effectiveness even before combat operations commenced. P-40's executing boom and zoom attacks proved nearly impossible to intercept when pilots maintained discipline and refused to be drawn into turning combat. Japanese-style tactics employed by aggressor pilots consistently failed to achieve firing positions against American fighters that exploited altitude and speed advantages. The training results suggested that Chennault's analysis was correct, but actual combat would provide the only definitive test of tactics that contradicted decades of fighter doctrine. By late November 1941, the American volunteer group had completed its training cycle and moved to operational bases in China and Burma. Kunming airfield in Yunnan province became home to the 1st and 2nd Pursuit Squadrons, while the 3rd Pursuit Squadron deployed to Mingaladon airfield near Rangoon. The deployment positioned American fighters to defend critical supply routes that linked Burma's ports to China's interior through mountain roads that represented nationalist China's only reliable connection to Western military aid. Since the outbreak of war between Japan and Western powers on December 8, 1941, bomber formations escorted by Ki-27 fighters struck transportation hubs, airfields, and infrastructure targets with relative impunity, facing minimal opposition from obsolete Chinese aircraft and small numbers of British fighters that proved unable to contest Japanese air superiority. The morning of December 20th brought the first test of Chennault's tactical doctrine against the combat reality of experienced Japanese pilots flying aircraft optimized for aerial superiority. Intelligence reports indicated a large-scale Japanese raid approaching Kunming, bomber formations escorted by fighters from the 64th Sentai, an experienced unit that had been operating over China since 1938. The American volunteer group launched 16 P-40's from Kunming at 0900 hours. Climbing to 18,000 feet over the airfield, in defensive formations that positioned them with maximum altitude advantage over approaching Japanese aircraft. Squadron leader Robert Neal led the 1st Pursuit Squadron section, scanning the eastern horizon for the bomber formation that Chinese observers had reported departing from Hanoi at first light. Radio discipline remained strict, with pilots maintaining radio silence except for essential tactical communications. At 0947, the Japanese formation appeared against the morning haze, approximately 30 aircraft arranged in tight defensive boxes that suggested experienced bomber crews, accustomed to coordinated defensive fire. Ki-27 escorts flew above and to the flanks of the bomber stream, positioned to intercept defending fighters that attempted orthodox attacks against the bomber formation. The Japanese tactical deployment assumed Allied fighters would engage in turning combat, allowing escort fighters to exploit their superior maneuverability against opponents committed to bomber interception. Neal's attack defied these expectations through systematic application of doctrine that transformed altitude advantage into lethal energy. The P-40 formation dove toward the Japanese bombers at maximum speed, approaching from above and behind in a geometry that minimized exposure to defensive fire while maximizing overtake velocity. Neal selected the lead bomber as his target, closing to within 150 yards before opening fire with all 650 caliber machine guns. The effect was catastrophic and immediate. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through the bomber's unprotected fuselage, severing control cables and igniting fuel tanks that exploded in a brilliant fireball visible for miles. The bomber disintegrated before Neal completed his attack pass, scattering debris that forced trailing bombers to take evasive action that disrupted their defensive formation. Neal's P-40 flashed through the bomber formation at over 400 miles per hour too, fast for defensive gunners to track effectively and far faster than Ki-27 escorts could match in pursuit. Lieutenant Charles Older executed a similar attack seconds later, selecting a bomber on the formation's left flank and destroying it with a 3-second burst that demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of concentrated 50 caliber fire against unarmored targets. The bomber's port wing separated completely from the fuselage, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin that gave the crew no opportunity for escape. Japanese escort fighters responded according to their training, attempting to intercept American fighters through turning maneuvers that brought them into firing positions behind the attacking P-40's. But Chennault's tactical doctrine anticipated this response through escape maneuvers that exploited the P-40's superior diving speed. American pilots completed their attack passes and immediately entered shallow dives that built velocity faster than Japanese fighters could match, extending away from the combat zone, while climbing back to altitude for subsequent attacks. Ki-27 pilots, attempting to follow, found their aircraft unable to maintain pursuit speeds during extended dives, while structural limitations prevented them from matching the P-40's diving performance without risking catastrophic airframe failure. The engagement continued for approximately 18 minutes, as American fighters executed repeated boom and zoom attacks against the Japanese formation, destroying bombers while refusing to engage escort fighters on terms that favored Japanese maneuverability advantages. Each attack cycle followed the same pattern: dive from altitude at maximum speed, fire a brief burst at close range, extend away in a shallow dive that denied Japanese fighters opportunities for interception, climb back to altitude for the next attack. The results exceeded even Chennault's optimistic predictions about his tactical doctrine's effectiveness. By the time the shattered Japanese formation retreated toward Indochina, 9 bombers had been destroyed outright with 4 more trailing smoke and losing altitude in patterns that suggested fatal damage. 3 Ki-27 escort fighters fell to P-40 guns during unsuccessful attempts to intercept American fighters that maintained speed and altitude discipline throughout the engagement. The American volunteer group lost 0 aircraft during the entire engagement, with only 2 P-40's sustaining minor battle damage from defensive fire that failed to penetrate armor protection or damage critical systems. The lopsided victory ratio provided immediate validation of tactical doctrine that had been developed through careful analysis rather than traditional fighter pilot instinct. Japanese tactical reports from the December 20th engagement revealed confusion and frustration among pilots who found themselves unable to engage opponents that refused to fight on familiar terms. Radio intercepts captured urgent communications between escort fighters and formation leaders, with Japanese pilots reporting that American fighters attacked at speeds that made interception impossible using standard turning tactics. References to high-speed slashing attacks appeared in subsequent Japanese tactical assessments, along with acknowledgements that Ki-27 performance characteristics provided no effective counter to opponents who maintained altitude and speed advantages through disciplined tactical execution. The psychological impact of this initial defeat resonated through Japanese air units operating across the China-Burma-India theater. For 4 years, Japanese fighters had dominated Asian skies through superior maneuverability that made them nearly invincible in turning combat. Chennault's P-40 pilots had demonstrated that maneuverability became irrelevant when opponents refused to engage in turning fights, instead exploiting performance characteristics that Japanese fighters couldn't match through any amount of pilot skill or tactical innovation. The fundamental assumption underlying Japanese fighter doctrine that turning combat represented the primary determinant of aerial superiority had been systematically invalidated by American tactics that transformed the engagement into a different type of contest entirely. The December 20th victory established patterns that would define the American volunteer group's combat operations throughout its 7-month operational history. Japanese formations approaching defended targets found themselves under attack by P-40's that dove from altitude, destroyed multiple aircraft in seconds, then disappeared before escort fighters could respond effectively. The hit-and-run tactics created a psychological impact that exceeded their direct military effect, with Japanese bomber crews becoming increasingly reluctant to press attacks against targets defended by the distinctive shark-mouthed P-40's that had become the American volunteer group's visual signature. Within weeks of commencing combat operations, Japanese tactical assessments began acknowledging the effectiveness of American tactics through recommendations that attempted to counter the P-40's altitude and speed advantages. Fighter escorts received instructions to maintain higher patrol altitudes, anticipating American attacks from above, rather than accepting the previous assumption that Japanese fighters would control the vertical dimension through superior climbing performance. Bomber formations adjusted their defensive tactics, increasing spacing between aircraft to reduce vulnerability to slashing attacks, while improving fields of fire for defensive gunners attempting to engage high-speed targets. But these adjustments proved inadequate against opponents who had fundamentally reimagined fighter combat through exploitation of performance characteristics rather than pilot skill in traditional dogfighting. The American volunteer groups' tactical doctrine represented more than clever improvisation. It reflected systematic analysis of the physics governing aerial combat, identifying performance envelopes where American aircraft held advantages, and developing tactics that forced engagements to occur within those favorable conditions, while denying Japanese pilots opportunities to exploit their own aircraft's strengths. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. January 16th, 1942. Mingaladon Airfield, Burma. The morning air raid warning sounded at 07:15, giving pilots barely enough time to reach operational altitude before Japanese formations appeared over the city of Rangoon. Flight leader Robert Prescott led 12 P-40's of the 3rd Pursuit Squadron in a climbing intercept that would demonstrate both the effectiveness of Chennault's tactical doctrine and its limitations when Japanese commanders adapted their own tactics to counter American advantages. The inbound raid consisted of 54 Ki-27 Sally bombers, escorted by 20 Ki-27 fighters, representing one of the largest Japanese air operations against Burma since hostilities commenced. Intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese were committing maximum available forces to eliminate the American volunteer group before the P-40's could establish air superiority over critical supply routes connecting Burma to China's interior. Prescott's formation reached 16,000 feet as the Japanese bomber stream approached at 12,000 feet, providing the altitude advantage that Chennault's doctrine required for effective engagement. But the Ki-27 escorts had positioned themselves at 18,000 feet, inverting the usual tactical geometry and forcing American pilots to attack through a fighter screen that held superior altitude. The Japanese adaptation demonstrated that enemy commanders were learning from previous encounters, adjusting their tactics to neutralize advantages that had made American fighters so effective during earlier engagements. The tactical situation required immediate decision-making under conditions where conventional doctrine provided no clear guidance. Attacking the bombers meant accepting combat with Ki-27 escorts that held altitude advantage, potentially triggering the turning combat that Chennault's tactics were specifically designed to avoid. Allowing the bomber formation to proceed unmolested meant accepting unacceptable damage to Rangoon's port facilities and civilian population. Prescott chose to attack, leading his formation in a steep climbing turn that built speed, while approaching the Japanese bomber stream from an oblique angle that minimized exposure to escort fighters. The geometry was complex, requiring precise calculation of intercept angles, closure rates, and escape vectors that would allow successful attacks against bombers while maintaining enough speed to avoid engagement with Japanese fighters positioned above the battle space. The engagement developed with brutal speed, as Prescott's P-40 opened fire on the lead bomber formation at a range of 200 yards, destroying the formation leader with a concentrated burst that severed the aircraft's tail section. But Ki-27 escorts responded immediately, diving toward the attacking P-40's in coordinated attacks that exploited their superior numbers and favorable positioning. For the first time, American pilots found themselves engaged in extended combat with Japanese fighters that had successfully negated the P-40's usual altitude advantage. Lieutenant Kenneth Jernstedt encountered the tactical dilemma that Chennault's doctrine had been designed to prevent when a Ki-27 positioned behind his P-40 during the bomber attack, forcing him into defensive maneuvers that burned energy and altitude. Despite Jernstedt's attempts to disengage through diving acceleration, at speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Ki-27 could match the P-40's performance during most maneuvers, creating a tactical stalemate where neither aircraft could achieve decisive advantage. Jernstedt's salvation came from his wingman, Lieutenant Frank Scheel, who had maintained formation discipline despite the chaotic engagement, and now positioned his P-40 for a deflection shot against the pursuing Ki-27. Scheel's burst struck the Japanese fighter's engine cowling, causing immediate mechanical failure that forced the Ki-27 pilot to break off pursuit and attempt an emergency landing. The engagement demonstrated the critical importance of mutual support between two aircraft elements, with wingmen providing defensive coverage that prevented individual pilots from being isolated and destroyed through Japanese numerical advantages. The air battle continued for approximately 23 minutes, far longer than the brief hit-and-run engagements that had characterized previous encounters between American and Japanese fighters. Extended combat revealed vulnerabilities in both tactical approaches. P-40's pilots who maintained speed and altitude discipline could disengage at will, but achieving decisive results against bomber formations required sustained engagement that increased exposure to escort fighters. Japanese pilots could exploit their maneuverability advantage during extended combat, but only if they could force American fighters into turning engagements rather than high-speed slashing attacks. By the engagement's conclusion, the 3rd Pursuit Squadron had destroyed 12 Japanese bombers and 3 Ki-27 escorts, disrupting the raid sufficiently that most bombs fell outside primary target areas. But the victory came at unprecedented cost. 4 P-40's sustained battle damage requiring extensive repairs, while 2 pilots were forced to bail out after their aircraft suffered. Catastrophic mechanical failures during high-stress combat maneuvering. Most seriously, Lieutenant Henry Gilbert was killed when his P-40 was hit by defensive fire from a bomber formation, severing hydraulic lines that caused control failure during his attack run. Gilbert's death provided sobering evidence that Chennault's tactical doctrine, while dramatically effective compared to conventional fighter tactics, could not eliminate combat risks entirely. Extended engagements against numerically superior Japanese formations created opportunities for defensive fire and escort interception that increased American casualties despite superior tactics and better protected aircraft. Post-mission analysis revealed the tactical lessons from the extended engagement over Rangoon. Chennault's doctrine remained fundamentally sound, but required strict adherence to its principles regarding altitude advantage and engagement discipline. Pilots who maintained formation integrity and refused to pursue individual targets achieved superior survival rates compared to those who broke formation to press attacks against isolated Japanese aircraft. The 2 aircraft element structure proved essential for mutual support, with wingmen providing defensive coverage that prevented isolation and destruction. Japanese tactical adaptations, particularly positioning escorts at higher altitudes, demonstrated that enemy commanders were learning from previous encounters and developing counters to American advantages. Future operations would require constant tactical innovation to maintain effectiveness against opponents who were actively studying American methods and implementing their own doctrinal changes. The intelligence reaching Chennault's headquarters painted an increasingly concerning picture of Japanese air strength in the China-Burma-India theater. New aircraft types were appearing in combat, most notably the Mitsubishi Ashest M0, which combined the Ki-27's legendary maneuverability with superior speed and firepower that made it far more dangerous than earlier Japanese fighters. The Zero mounted 2 20mm cannons, plus 2 7.7mm machine guns, providing firepower approaching half the P-40's destructive capability, while maintaining turning performance that exceeded even the Ki-27's remarkable agility. Technical intelligence indicated the Zero could reach speeds of 331 miles per hour at optimal altitude, significantly faster than the Ki-27, but still slower than the P-40's maximum performance of 360 miles per hour. More concerning was the Zero's service ceiling of 33,000 feet and climb rate of 3,000 feet per minute, performance characteristics that challenged the P-40's ability to maintain altitude advantages that Chennault's doctrine required for tactical success. Against the Zero, American pilots would need to execute their boom and zoom tactics with even greater precision, exploiting narrower performance margins while accepting increased risk from an opponent that combined Japanese maneuverability with performance capabilities approaching Western fighter standards. The first confirmed encounter between American volunteer group P-40's and Japanese Zeros occurred on January 24, 1942, during an escort mission protecting RAF bombers attacking Japanese positions near Tak, Thailand. Squadron leader Robert Neal led 6 P-40's, providing high cover for the bomber formation when 12 Zeros appeared at 20,000 feet, diving toward the Allied aircraft, in a coordinated attack that demonstrated sophisticated tactical execution. The Zero pilots clearly understood they were facing opponents who fought differently than the British and Chinese pilots they had previously encountered, positioning their aircraft for high-speed attack runs rather than immediate turning combat. Neil recognized the tactical challenge instantly. The Zeros held altitude advantage and were faster in level flight than intelligence estimates had suggested, potentially negating the P-40's usual superiority in diving speed and energy retention. But the fundamental physics of aerial combat still favored the heavier American fighter during vertical maneuvers, and Neil exploited this advantage through aggressive defensive tactics that transformed the Japanese attack into an extended vertical chase. As the lead Zero dove toward his P-40, Neil rolled inverted and pulled through into a split S maneuver that traded altitude for maximum speed, diving toward the ground at an angle that built velocity faster than the pursuing Zero could match. The Japanese pilot followed initially, but as airspeed approached 400 miles per hour, the Zero began experiencing control stiffness that limited maneuvering effectiveness at high speeds. This was the critical vulnerability that Chennault's intelligence network had identified through careful analysis of Zero performance characteristics. The aircraft's lightweight construction and fabric-covered control surfaces, which provided extraordinary maneuverability at low speeds, became liabilities during high-speed flight when aerodynamic forces overwhelmed the control systems. At speeds above 350 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons required excessive force to achieve roll response, while elevator effectiveness decreased to the point where high-speed maneuvering became extremely difficult. Neil bottomed out of his dive at 8,000 feet, having built sufficient speed to extend away from the pursuing Zero in level flight. The Japanese pilot, recognizing he could not maintain pursuit against a faster opponent, broke off and climbed back toward altitude where his aircraft's maneuverability advantages remained relevant. The brief engagement had demonstrated that Chennault's tactical doctrine remained effective even against Japan's most advanced fighter, provided American pilots maintained speed discipline and refused to engage in turning combat where the Zero's capabilities provided overwhelming advantages. The remainder of the engagement followed predictable patterns as P-40 pilots exploited their aircraft's superior diving speed and structural strength to avoid prolonged combat with Zeros that held maneuverability. Advantages. American fighters made slashing attacks against the bomber formation, destroyed 3 bombers and damaged 2 more, then disengaged before Zero escorts could force turning engagements. The Zeros destroyed 0 Allied aircraft during the entire encounter, despite their superior numbers and performance characteristics that should have provided tactical advantages. Japanese pilot reports from the engagement revealed frustration, similar to earlier encounters with American fighters. Radio intercepts captured communications describing American tactics as cowardly and refusing proper combat, phrases that demonstrated how completely Chennault's doctrine challenged Japanese assumptions about fighter warfare. Japanese pilots had been trained to view aerial combat as a test of individual skill and aircraft maneuverability, with victory going to the pilot who could execute tighter turns and maintain better situational awareness during swirling dogfights. The American approach, which emphasized physics over pilot skill and systematic exploitation of performance advantages over individual heroics, represented a fundamentally different philosophy that Japanese training had not prepared pilots to counter effectively. The tactical implications extended beyond individual engagements to shape the broader strategic situation across the China-Burma-India theater. Japanese air forces had been accustomed to achieving air superiority through aggressive fighter sweeps that cleared Allied aircraft from contested airspace, allowing bomber formations to operate with minimal interference. Against the American volunteer group, these tactics proved increasingly ineffective, as P-40 pilots refused to engage on Japanese terms. Fighter sweeps encountered no opposition, because American fighters simply avoided combat when tactical conditions were unfavorable, preserving their strength for engagements where they held advantages. Japanese bomber formations faced repeated attacks from opponents who appeared suddenly from altitude, inflicted significant damage, then disappeared before escorts could respond. By late February 1942, Japanese air operations over Burma and southern China had become significantly more costly in terms of aircraft losses and reduced operational effectiveness. Bomber formations required larger escort forces to provide adequate protection against American attacks, reducing the sortie rates that Japanese units could maintain with available aircraft and pilots. More critically, the psychological advantage that Japanese air forces had enjoyed since the wars was eroding as pilots encountered opponents who consistently outfought them, despite flying aircraft that conventional analysis suggested were inferior. The intelligence reaching Japanese headquarters in Hanoi painted an increasingly concerning picture of American tactical effectiveness. Combat loss reports indicated the American volunteer group was achieving kill ratios approaching 10-1, destroying Japanese aircraft at rates that far exceeded replacement capabilities. Even more troubling were pilot quality assessments suggesting that American volunteers were not the inexperienced mercenaries that Japanese propaganda had portrayed, but rather experienced military aviators who flew with tactical discipline and systematic precision that reflected professional military training. Japanese commanders faced a strategic dilemma with no easy resolution. Reducing air operations over contested territories meant conceding air superiority to an opponent with far fewer aircraft and pilots, an unacceptable outcome that would jeopardize ground operations across the theater. Maintaining current operational tempo meant accepting aircraft losses that Japanese industrial production could not sustain indefinitely, while exhausting pilot reserves that required years to replace through training programs that emphasized quality over quantity. The solution attempted by Japanese air commanders involved tactical innovations designed to counter American advantages through coordinated attacks that exploited numerical superiority and superior aircraft performance at specific altitudes. Fighter sweeps began operating at 25,000 feet, altitudes where the Zero's climb performance gave it advantages over the P-40's more limited high-altitude capabilities. Bomber formations adopted tighter defensive boxes with increased fighter escort ratios, creating layered defenses designed to make American slashing attacks more costly. But these adaptations encountered fundamental limitations created by resource constraints and strategic priorities that governed Japanese military operations. Fighter units throughout the Pacific Theater faced competing demands for air support, with critical battles in the Philippines, Netherlands, East Indies, and New Guinea requiring maximum available aircraft and experienced pilots. The China-Burma-India theatre, while strategically important for isolating nationalist China and threatening British India, represented a secondary priority compared to operations directly supporting Japan's southern expansion. Aircraft and pilot allocations reflected these strategic calculations, with frontline units in China and Burma receiving older aircraft types and less experienced pilots compared to elite formations operating in primary theaters. The American volunteer group, despite its small size, benefited from fighting in a theater where it faced opponents who were generally less capable than the elite Japanese naval aviation, units that would later dominate Pacific combat operations. March 19, 1942 brought the largest air battle of the Burma campaign, when Japanese forces launched coordinated attacks against Magway airfield, attempting to destroy the RAF's remaining combat capability in central Burma. The American volunteer group deployed 16 P-40's to defend the airfield against an estimated 70 Japanese aircraft, including bombers and fighter escorts that represented the largest concentration of enemy air power committed to a single operation since hostilities began. Squadron leader Robert Neal positioned his fighters at 22,000 feet, accepting that some Japanese escorts would hold altitude advantages, but calculating that the superior numbers made lower altitude positioning suicidal. The approaching Japanese formation stretched across miles of airspace, bombers arranged in multiple waves with fighter escorts distributed at various altitudes to provide layered protection against defending fighters. The tactical situation demanded immediate engagement despite unfavorable conditions, as allowing the bomber formation to proceed unmolested would result in catastrophic damage to critical airfield facilities. Neil led the first attack wave in a near-vertical dive that built airspeed to over 450 miles per hour, approaching the bomber formation from an angle that minimized exposure to escort fighters while maximizing overtake velocity against the bombers themselves. The effect of concentrated P-40 attacks against the tightly packed bomber formation was devastating beyond anything witnessed in previous engagements. 6 bombers disintegrated under focused .50 caliber fire during the first attack pass, their unarmored structures unable to withstand the kinetic energy delivered by multiple aircraft firing simultaneously. Trailing bomber elements broke formation in panic, disrupting carefully planned attack sequences and creating chaos throughout the Japanese formation. Japanese fighter escorts responded aggressively, but found themselves unable to effectively intercept P-40's that maintained speed discipline during attack runs. Ki-27 fighters attempting pursuit could not match American diving performance, while Zeros that managed to achieve favorable positions discovered their targets had already extended beyond effective firing range before interception could occur. The layered escort defense that looked formidable on paper proved ineffective against opponents who attacked at speeds that exceeded Japanese fighters' ability to respond. The air battle continued for 37 minutes, as American fighters executed repeated attack cycles against the bomber formation, exploiting their ammunition reserves and operational altitude to maintain offensive pressure despite overwhelming Japanese numerical advantages. The engagement's duration exceeded Chennault's preferred quick-strike doctrine, but the target's importance justified, accepting increased risk from extended combat operations. By the engagement's conclusion, the American volunteer group had destroyed 24 Japanese bombers and 8 escort fighters, representing one of the most lopsided aerial victories in military aviation history. The P-40 formation lost 2 aircraft to battle damage, though both pilots survived and returned to friendly territory after emergency landings. More critically, the Japanese raid had been completely disrupted, with surviving bombers jettisoning their ordnance over unpopulated areas rather than pressing attacks against defended targets. The tactical success at Magway demonstrated that Chennault's doctrine could achieve extraordinary results even under unfavorable conditions, provided pilots maintained formation discipline and exploited their aircraft's performance advantages through systematic tactical application. But the engagement also revealed the physical and psychological toll of sustained combat operations against numerically superior opponents. American pilots were flying multiple combat missions daily, engaging Japanese formations that typically outnumbered them by 3 or 4 to 1, and accepting risks that would have been considered unacceptable under conventional operational planning. Personnel losses were beginning to accumulate despite favorable kill ratios, with experienced pilots killed or wounded at rates that the volunteer group's limited replacement pipeline could not sustain indefinitely. By late March, several pilots had exceeded 100 combat hours, fatigue levels that degraded decision-making and increased accident rates even among the most experienced aviators. The operational tempo was simply unsustainable without reinforcement and relief that American military authorities were not yet prepared to provide. The fall of Rangoon to Japanese ground forces on March 8th had already signaled the eventual collapse of Allied positions in Burma, forcing the American volunteer group to relocate operations to bases in China, where logistical support and maintenance facilities were significantly more limited. Aircraft serviceability rates declined, as spare parts became increasingly scarce, and maintenance personnel struggled to keep combat-damaged P-40's operational under primitive field conditions. April and May operations reflected these deteriorating conditions as the American volunteer group transitioned from offensive air superiority missions to defensive operations protecting Chinese cities and supply routes from Japanese air attacks. The tactical situation remained favorable when American fighters could engage on terms dictated by Chennault's doctrine, but Japanese commanders increasingly avoided combat with P-40 formations, instead timing their attacks to exploit gaps in American coverage created by limited aircraft availability and exhausted pilot rosters. Statistical analysis of combat operations from December through June revealed the unprecedented effectiveness of Chennault's tactical doctrine under real-world combat conditions. The American volunteer group flew 296 combat missions over 7 months, engaging Japanese formations on 147 separate occasions with results that defied conventional military analysis. Official victory claims totaled 297 Japanese aircraft destroyed, though post-war analysis of Japanese records confirmed only approximately 115 actual losses attributable to American volunteer group combat actions. The discrepancy reflected common overclaiming patterns in aerial combat, where multiple pilots engaged the same target, each believing their fire had achieved the kill. But even using conservative Japanese loss figures, the kill ratio remained extraordinary. 115 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed against 14 American P-40's lost to enemy action represented an 8-to-1 victory, a ratio that exceeded any other fighter unit's performance during the same period. More revealing were bomber escort effectiveness statistics that demonstrated the doctrine's primary strategic value. During bomber escort missions, the American volunteer group protected formations achieved target objectives in 91% of missions, while losing only 7 bombers to enemy fighter attacks. Comparable escort effectiveness in other theaters rarely exceeded 70%, with bomber losses frequently reaching 15 to 20% on deep penetration missions. The performance differential reflected fundamental advantages created by Chennault's tactical doctrine, which prioritized bomber protection over individual pilot glory. American fighters remained with their bomber charges throughout entire missions, refusing to be drawn away by Japanese fighters attempting to clear escorts before attacking vulnerable bombers. This discipline, which contradicted fighter-pilot instincts, emphasizing aggressive pursuit, proved far more effective at achieving strategic objectives than conventional escort tactics. Pilot survival statistics provided equally compelling evidence of the doctrine's superiority over traditional fighter tactics. Of the original 99 pilots who began combat operations with the American volunteer group, 73 survived their entire combat tour without serious injury, despite flying in a theater where Japanese air forces held overwhelming numerical advantages. The survival rate of 74% far exceeded comparable statistics from other theaters where fighter pilots faced similar operational intensity. The P-40's armor protection and robust construction contributed significantly to these survival rates, absorbing battle damage that would have destroyed Japanese fighters. Multiple pilots returned from missions with aircraft that had sustained dozens of hits from 7.7mm rounds. The damaged aircraft, remaining flyable due to redundant control systems and protected critical components that kept engines running and controls responding, despite extensive structural damage. Lieutenant Kenneth Jernstedt's experience on May 4th exemplified the P-40's survivability advantages. His aircraft sustained 47 hits during an engagement with 0 fighters, including rounds that penetrated the cockpit area and damaged his radio equipment. Despite the extensive damage, the P-40 remained controllable throughout the engagement and successfully returned to base where maintenance crews catalogued the battle damage. A Japanese fighter sustaining similar damage would likely have disintegrated in flight, killing its pilot and eliminating valuable combat experience from the Japanese pilot roster. The cumulative effect of these survival advantages became apparent through pilot experience differentials that developed over sustained campaign periods. American volunteer group pilots accumulated combat experience at rates that increased their effectiveness with each engagement, learning tactical nuances and aircraft handling techniques that could only be developed through repeated exposure to life-threatening situations. Japanese pilots, facing opponents who systematically exploited their vulnerabilities, died at rates that prevented similar experience accumulation across their pilot population. By June 1942, the average American volunteer group pilot had flown over 90 combat missions against Japanese aircraft, accumulating tactical knowledge that made them extraordinarily effective, even accounting for the P-40's performance limitations. Japanese units operating in the China-Burma-India theater faced continuous pilot turnover as experienced aviators were killed or transferred to more critical theatres, replaced by less experienced pilots who repeated the same tactical mistakes their predecessors had made months earlier. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate combat results to shape the broader Pacific War's trajectory. Japanese military planning had assumed air superiority over China, and Burma would be readily achieved and maintained through aggressive operations, exploiting superior Japanese fighter performance and pilot skill. The American volunteer group's success demonstrated these assumptions were flawed, revealing vulnerabilities in Japanese tactical doctrine and aircraft design that could be exploited through proper application of Western fighter capabilities. American military planners, studying the volunteer group's combat records, recognized that Japanese air power, while formidable, was not invincible when confronted by opponents who understood its limitations and developed tactics specifically designed to exploit weaknesses rather than challenge strengths. The lessons learned from 7 months of combat operations in China would shape American fighter doctrine throughout the Pacific War, influencing aircraft, design requirements, tactical training programs, and operational planning that emphasized systematic exploitation of performance advantages over pilot skill in turning combat. The American Volunteer Group officially disbanded on July 4, 1942, absorbed into regular U.S. Army Air Forces command structure as Japanese military pressure forced consolidation of Allied air assets under unified command. But the tactical legacy persisted through doctrine that had proven its effectiveness under the most demanding combat conditions. Fighter pilots throughout the Pacific Theater adopted boom and zoom tactics that exploited American aircraft performance advantages while avoiding turning combat with nimble Japanese fighters. The P-40's Warhawk, dismissed as obsolete and inadequate by conventional military analysis, had achieved one of the most remarkable combat records in aviation history through tactical application that transformed apparent weaknesses into decisive advantages. Its slower turning radius became irrelevant when pilots refused to engage in turning combat. Its lower top speed provided sufficient performance superiority over Japanese fighters to enable hit-and-run tactics that Japanese pilots could not effectively counter. Perhaps most significantly, the P-40's armor protection and robust construction, design features that conventional doctrine viewed as unnecessary weight that reduced performance, proved essential for pilot survival and sustained combat effectiveness. Japanese fighters achieved their remarkable maneuverability by sacrificing pilot protection and structural strength, creating aircraft that were extraordinarily effective in single engagements but catastrophically vulnerable to sustained campaign operations, where pilot survival determined long-term effectiveness. Post-war analysis of Japanese air operations in the China-Burma-India theater revealed the psychological impact of sustained defeats against the American volunteer group. Japanese pilot morale declined significantly after repeated encounters with P-40 formations that consistently outfought them despite numerical disadvantages and supposedly inferior equipment. References to Fei Hu, the Chinese name for flying tigers that American pilots adopted as their unofficial designation, appeared frequently in Japanese tactical communications with experienced pilots, warning newcomers that the shark-mouthed P-40's represented serious threats, requiring careful tactical consideration. More telling were Japanese tactical assessments acknowledging that American fighters operated with systematic discipline that suggested professional military training rather than the mercenary adventurers that propaganda had portrayed. Japanese intelligence officers correctly identified Claire Chennault as a former U.S. Army Air Corps officer who had developed sophisticated tactical doctrine specifically optimized for exploiting P-40 performance characteristics against Japanese fighter weaknesses. The assessment concluded that American success reflected systematic planning and tactical innovation rather than superior individual pilot skill, a recognition that Japanese training methods emphasizing pilot ability over systematic tactical doctrine had been outmatched by opponents who approached aerial combat as an engineering problem requiring scientific solutions rather than tests of personal courage and flying skill. Technical intelligence gathered from captured P-40's wreckage provided Japanese engineers with detailed knowledge of American fighter construction methods and design philosophy. The analysis revealed significant differences in engineering approaches between Japanese and American aircraft design, with American engineers accepting higher aircraft weights in exchange for armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust structures that could sustain battle damage without catastrophic failure. Japanese designers had consciously rejected these design priorities, instead optimizing for maximum performance through weight reduction that sacrificed pilot protection and structural safety margins. The contrasting philosophies reflected broader cultural differences in how each nation valued pilot lives relative to aircraft performance, with profound implications for sustained combat operations, where pilot survival rates determined long-term force effectiveness. The P-40's 650 caliber machine guns represented another significant advantage that Japanese technical analysis identified as crucial to American tactical success. The concentrated firepower allowed American pilots to destroy Japanese aircraft with brief firing bursts, typically 2 to 3 seconds of sustained fire at close range. Japanese fighters mounting two 7.7mm machine guns required extended firing opportunities to inflict comparable damage, opportunities that American tactics systematically denied through high-speed attack runs that minimized exposure to Japanese return fire. Ammunition capacity analysis revealed additional advantages favoring American designs. The P-40 carried approximately 200 rounds per gun, enough ammunition for approximately 30 seconds of sustained firing distributed across multiple engagement opportunities. Japanese fighters typically carried 450 rounds per gun, seemingly superior, until factoring in the significantly lower per second destructive capacity of 7.7mm rounds compared to 50 caliber ammunition. The practical result was that P-40 pilots could engage multiple targets during extended missions without exhausting ammunition reserves, while Japanese pilots needed to exercise extreme fire discipline to avoid depleting their ammunition during brief firing opportunities. The ammunition advantage, combined with superior firepower per second, created tactical flexibility that allowed American fighters to sustain combat effectiveness throughout entire missions, rather than becoming vulnerable after initial engagements, exhausted limited ammunition supplies. By late summer 1942, the tactical lessons from the American Volunteer Group's combat operations had been incorporated into fighter doctrine throughout American military aviation. Training programs emphasized boom and zoom tactics that exploited altitude and speed advantages while avoiding turning combat with maneuverable opponents. Aircraft performance requirements shifted toward designs that prioritized diving speed, structural strength, and pilot protection over maximum maneuverability in turning combat. Japanese tactical doctrine evolved more slowly, hampered by cultural factors that made systematic revision of established training methods difficult without acknowledging fundamental errors in previous approaches. Fighter pilots continued receiving training that emphasized turning combat and individual skill development with limited attention to energy management tactics that might have countered American boom and zoom attacks more effectively. The institutional resistance to tactical innovation reflected broader rigidity within Japanese military culture, where questioning established doctrine implied criticism of superiors who had developed that doctrine. The strategic consequences became apparent during subsequent Pacific campaigns, where Japanese air forces faced American fighters employing tactics refined from Chennault's original doctrine. At Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands, and throughout the Central Pacific Advance, American fighters consistently achieved favorable kill ratios against Japanese opponents, despite facing newer aircraft types with improved performance characteristics. The tactical advantages that Chennault's volunteers had demonstrated against Ki-27 and early model Zeros proved equally effective against more advanced Japanese fighters that appeared later in the war. More critically, American pilot survival rates remained significantly higher than Japanese losses throughout the entire Pacific conflict, creating experience differentials that compounded American tactical advantages as the war progressed. By 1944, average American fighter pilot combat experience exceeded 100 hours compared to Japanese averages below 30 hours, reflecting the cumulative impact of tactical doctrine that prioritized pilot survival alongside mission effectiveness. The human cost of Japanese tactical doctrine became tragically apparent through pilot casualty statistics that revealed the consequences of design philosophies, emphasizing performance over pilot protection. Japanese fighter pilot casualty rates exceeded 70% by war's end, with experienced aviators killed at rates that training programs could not replace despite heroic efforts to increase pilot production. The systematic destruction of Japan's most experienced pilots through combat losses that Western tactical doctrine might have prevented represented one of the Pacific War's most significant strategic outcomes. The Flying Tiger's legacy extended beyond impressive kill ratios to encompass broader lessons about military innovation and institutional learning. Chennault had challenged decades of fighter doctrine through systematic analysis of aircraft performance, characteristics, and tactical creativity that reimagined aerial combat as physics problems requiring engineering solutions rather than tests of individual pilot courage. His success demonstrated that technological advantages could be created through tactical innovation, even when aircraft performance specifications appeared inferior according to conventional metrics. The shark-mouthed P-40's that became iconic symbols of American air power in China represented more than colorful markings on obsolete fighters. They embodied a revolutionary approach to aerial warfare that prioritized systematic exploitation of performance. Advantages over romantic notions of individual pilot skill in turning dogfights. The tactical doctrine that Chennault developed and his volunteer pilots validated through combat became the foundation for American fighter operations throughout World War II, influencing training methods, aircraft design requirements, and operational planning that emphasized coordinated tactical execution over individual heroics. Japanese pilots who had mocked the P-40's speed and dismissed American volunteers as inferior opponents learned through bitter experience that success in aerial combat depended less on aircraft turning radius than on tactical, discipline, and systematic exploitation of performance advantages. The lessons proved decisive not merely for individual engagements, but for the broader strategic contest that determined the Pacific War's outcome. Air superiority, achieved through tactical innovation rather than aircraft performance superiority alone, enabled American offensive operations that systematically destroyed Japan's ability to wage war. The final accounting of the Flying Tiger's 7-month combat tour revealed achievements that exceeded even optimistic predictions about Chennault's tactical doctrine. 297 claimed victories against 14 combat losses represented a 21-to-1 kill ratio, using official American figures, though conservative post-war analysis, reducing confirmed kills to approximately 115 still produced an 8-to-1 advantage that far exceeded contemporary fighter unit performance. More significantly, the bomber escort effectiveness and pilot survival rates demonstrated that tactical doctrine emphasizing discipline over aggression, systematic exploitation of advantages over instinctive pursuit, and mission accomplishment over individual glory could achieve strategic objectives more effectively than conventional fighter tactics. The lessons learned over Chinese skies during 1941 and 1942 influenced American air power doctrine for generations, establishing principles that remained relevant long after the P-40 Warhawk had been retired to museums and the original Flying Tigers had returned to civilian life. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.